people sometimes overestimate how strong and how stable this system is. It really depends on a lot of improvisation, intervention from the top to keep things moving. You get these big bottlenecks if it's an issue that Putin's not personally interested in, and people trying to sort of change the decision and bring him in.
So, for the last part of this conversation, I want to um, look ahead and talk about the future of the current system that there is in Russia, which can be called Putinism. So, uh, we talked about the future for Putin himself, but how about the system? Um, how stable is it? How will it evolve, and what is the legacy going to be from the system? So, um, like, first, can you explain what the relationship is between Putin the man and Putinism as a system, as you like to talk about it?
Well, the system comes by its name, honestly, right? It's called the Putinist system for a reason, which is that Putin is the guy who's defined the system, who's defined the trajectory of the system, who's been the key decision maker for more than 2 decades. And yes, he works with the team. He doesn't do everything himself. It's impossible to do everything. Lots of decisions get made by other people. But ultimately, it's been his mentality, his way of seeing the world that's kind of defined the policy trajectory for Russia, both internally and externally, for the last couple of decades. Now, there is something that I call Team Putin, right? So it's not just him. And there's a group of people that are close to him, that have been close to him for a long time. Many of them he knew from either the KGB or for his time working in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg, who stuck with him. But it's a generational thing to a certain extent. Many of these people are roughly in the same age cohort as Putin, who will be 70 later this year. So even if, you know, Putin and the system sort of part ways, right? The system tries to continue absent Putin. There is going to be a generational turnover coming at some point. So, in a scenario in which Putin leaves the scene, yes, some of the old guard will try and keep it going because they benefit from that system. They believe in that system. First of all, they might not succeed in acquiring power, and second of all, as I've referred to, it's there's going to become a time of generational change in which the closest Putin cronies are no longer able to dominate the system. And uh, we don't know for sure if generational change will bring political change, but I think it would create a bigger opportunity for that type of major change in direction when that happens.
So, when you wrote your book, I think it came out in 2018. So that's probably some 5 years ago you wrote that book, and I guess at that point in time, it was quite hard to imagine where we'd be today with a war in Ukraine. But already then, you mentioned that the current Russian system has a lot of weaknesses, and that it will require change in the future. That the way it works, it's kind of on a trajectory that is unsustainable in the long run. Um, what is your view on that now, after the war? Has it changed your view on that, or are we just is it going faster, or what is the direction now?
I think it's reinforced my belief that the system that Putin has built uh, is one that has many weaknesses. You said earlier systems like this are very stable until they are not, and I think that's true. So it's hard to predict how and when they're going to unravel. Uh, but fundamentally, I would come back to the notion that because it's this personalist autocracy in which informal networks matter so much, in which other institutions, both state institutions and societal institutions, have all been weakened or undermined or are tied to the Kremlin and to the presidency. It's a very weakly institutionalized kind of system. And I like to refer to this remark Putin made now 15 years ago in 2007, uh, when he was talking about how, because Russia came out of this crisis after the Soviet collapse, they needed to operate under a regime of what he called manual steering or manual control. And I think what that means is he doesn't trust institutions to do their jobs without him constantly interfering in them. And if the president is constantly interfering, then they're not really institutions in terms of regularized patterns of behavior, stable rules of the game, and that kind of thing. And so that's what this system has lacked, really. And one reason I think that people sometimes overestimate how strong and how stable this system is. It really depends on a lot of improvisation, intervention from the top to keep things moving. You get these big bottlenecks if it's an issue that Putin's not personally interested in, and people trying to sort of change the decision and bring him in if they're on a losing end of it. There just isn't regularized sort of rule of law institutional mechanisms for moving things through the system. And so uh, that's why I think it's quite fragile in some important ways.
So when at some point there will be some kind of change in Russia, uh, maybe in an orderly, peaceful way, or maybe in a more sort of violent way, but there will come a time when there will be some kind of change. What is the heritage going to be from this very long period of Putin's reign?
I think in hindsight, the Putin period is going to be seen as a dead end, uh, as a missed opportunity, and as a system with a series of policies that really have set Russia back, both internally and externally. So people, in the first decade of the Putin presidency could point to many things that they saw as positive changes, especially in his first term, in terms of some economic things, in terms of some legal changes, even some public administration reforms. But ultimately, I think we have to say, even though he was in some sense lucky by coming to power at a time when the economy had just started to recover, at a time when world energy prices were about to start to rise very quickly, uh, that sort of windfall of resources that could have been used to build better institutions, invest in human capital, education, healthcare, material capital in terms of infrastructure and things like that. A lot of those resources were squandered on corruption, on building the authoritarian system, on enriching his cronies, and on war. And I think. This Ukraine war that's been going for 8 years and is at obviously a new phase of intensity since February is going to require a lot of soul searching among the Russian elite and the Russian population. When the Soviet Union collapsed, uh, the new Russian leadership, through a series of agreements, committed themselves to respecting the borders of its neighbors, said they wanted to become a quote unquote normal country, which at the time meant a market capitalist and democratic rule of law state. They did make the transition to capitalism. It's a certain type of capitalism, but they did make that transition. But they didn't succeed in building a rule of law state. They didn't succeed in building a democratic institution or democratic system with strong institutions. And they've squandered a lot of resources on misadventures, both internal and external. And I think they need to uh, this is me speaking from the outside, obviously, but I think the Russian elite and the Russian population really need to evaluate what role they want to play in the world going forward. And can it be one that's not just associated with imperial wars of aggression and, pumping out gas and oil, but also trying to offer something more positive to the world? And they have a highly educated, very talented society that this regime has, in some sense, driven out of the country or driven out of social, economic, and political life. and they're going to want to, I hope, in the future, draw on this wealth of talent that they have in the country to maybe chart a different trajectory than the one that they've been on under Putin.
Um, but if I may just push back a little bit
Yeah.
on that, I assume that um, some of the ideas that you mentioned Putin has about the Russia's place in the world, being a great power, things like that, are ideas that are shared among most Russians, aren't they? Like, um, how would that sort of play together with a sort of kind of soul searching process and um, realizing the mistakes and lost opportunities?
No, that's a great question. And I think you're definitely right to say that this desire and belief that Russia is and remains a great power, it's not simply Putin. It's very widely shared among the elite, very widely shared among the population. But there are different ways of defining what one's role is as a great power in the world, particularly in the 21st century. So, if we look at Levada opinion polling, yes, people often say what they want from their leader is to have Russia be a respected great power. But then, if you drill down into the questions associated with that, what it means to be a respected great power to people often means things like a high standard of living and those sorts of things. So I think it's possible, for a different post-Putin Russia to define what great power status means, not simply in terms of subjugating its neighbors, but also participating in international society in a way in which Russia has status, not because of tanks and artillery, but because of innovation, because of culture and those sorts of things. So I think a different leader could redefine what it means for Russia to be a great power in this way that I'm talking about. I'm not necessarily predicting it. I'm just saying there's an opportunity that will emerge after Putin and after this war for Russian society and the Russian elite to rethink that. It may not happen. You're right to say that some of these ideas I think are in some sense strongly embedded, but uh, oftentimes it's after mistakes and uh, we'll see how this ends and how things play out, but I think in the long run this war is debilitating for Russia's future, and some people will understand that and think about how Russia could behave differently. That's a hope, but even though there hasn't been much in the last 3.5 months to give us much hope about Russia, I still have that latent sort of uh, maybe it's naive Americanism, or maybe it's Russophilia, like looking at the more positive sides of Russia that make me think there's more to Russia than Putin's imperial war of conquest.